My name is Ian Hamilton, and I am an accessibility specialist working in video games. I kind of have two roles, advocacy and consultancy. So, from the advocacy side, it's just raising awareness and educating, both amongst the gaming public and amongst developers, letting people know that accessibility is a thing, why it matters, and what you can do about it. And the other side is consulting. So that's generally if there's a company that either doesn't quite have the right expertise or has the expertise but doesn't have the time, then they'll bring me in to help out with whichever kind of accessibility problem they're trying to solve.
Yeah. So how do you think we can go about getting more awareness about accessible gaming? Why is it so important, in your opinion?
Well, I think the simple answer to why accessibility in games is important is because games are important. Games are a huge part of our culture. You know, FIFA and Call of Duty sell more copies than Star Wars. So it's a big deal to be excluded from, which means the other side to that is it's a big deal to be included in. Gaming can be a really powerful source of inclusion in society, and also access to recreation, culture, socializing, all those kind of things that a lot of people take for granted. But if your means of accessing those are in day-to-day life are in some way restricted, that means that any game at all really can be a powerful contributor to people's quality of life.
Yeah, yeah. I don't know about you, but it's always been something that's been important to me growing up. Because obviously the physical aspects. I might not be able to like go outside and play football with my mates, but I can still play online Call of Duty and FIFA.
Yep.
So it's always been extremely important to me, and I think to a lot of kind of people with Duchenne as well. Seems to be quite important to our community. So as a specialist, what can you do to help disabled gamers? I know you've already kind of touched upon your consultancy and stuff. Um,
Yeah, so that's the main role, and it's kind of shifting as well because for a lot of time it was all about kind of awareness raising, so advocating to let developers know that accessibility was even a thing that existed. You know, there's a
yeah,
lot of developers who had never even thought about would a disabled person even play a game, hadn't even entered their minds. That battle is pretty much won now. So it's increasingly hard to find a game developer who hasn't at least heard about accessibility, and actually even now becoming hard to find developers who haven't at least had some kind of experience with some kind of accessibility consideration, whether it's color blindness or button remapping or subtitles or something like that. So it's getting there in terms of awareness, but where there's still a lot of work to do is around misconceptions. So people thinking who have heard of accessibility but assume that it's going to be really difficult and expensive and is going to mean having to dilute their ideas down to suit like a tiny minority who probably don't even play games anyway, and all that kind of stuff, which is all completely demonstrably false. So there's some work to be done around that still, those kind of misconceptions. And part of that is the business case. That's what quite often comes up with studios at the moment, is people who are trying to do good things but having a tough time kind of putting the case to their co-workers about why this feature should be worked on versus everything else that's there in the backlog that has to be done. So although you've made good progress and have got like a good step forward, there's still a long way to go.
definitely. What are developers doing just now, do you think, to make it more accessible? And how are they thinking about it that they haven't previously thought about?
Well, is it kind of an interesting point, because point of the development of the field and of the industry, because over the past few years, there's been a lot of companies who are kind of dipping their toe in the water for the first time. And it's a typical kind of journey that companies go through, where quite late in the development of a game, um, they'll start thinking about accessibility for the first time, manage to put in like a couple of features quite late in development, which is hard to do. Once everything's already built, it can be quite hard to try and unpick things and rework them. Manage to do like a few things late in development, and then they always have the same reaction, which is, oh my God, if only we thought about this earlier, we could have done so much more, we could have done it so much better. And that's kind of the stage that a lot of companies are at now. So over the last kind of year or two in particular, they've got to kind of that point, And now they're in those early stages of actually being able to think about it earlier, being able to do better things, which The Last of Us 2 got a lot of press for its accessibility efforts. That was kind of like an early example of that, like next generation on, because they went through that journey with their previous game, which was Uncharted 4, which again got good accessibility press at the time, back in 2016. They thought, if only we thought about it from the start. At the time, it was quite early in development of Uncharted 4. Sorry, not Uncharted 4, Last of Us 2. So when Uncharted 4 came out, it's quite early in development of The Last of Us 2. So that meant for The Last of Us 2, they were able to think about it early, which meant they had lots of opportunity for working directly with the community, doing lots of user research, working with accessibility consultants and stuff, and we're able to do really good stuff. So it's quite exciting, that point now where you got all these companies who are kind of embarking on the next step. Okay, now we start thinking about accessibility. How do we now do a better job of it? How can we better engage with the community? How can we put better processes in place? All that kind of stuff. So the next, I mean, it takes a long time to make a game, especially like the big name, like big budget AAA games. So it takes like a few years for these kind of impacts to filter through. But what it does mean is that the coming like next kind of like year or two, 3 years or so, is going to be a time of quite fundamental change, I think, which is very exciting.
Yeah, that was a good example you mentioned, and for me, it was Spider-Man, which I played the first one on PS4, and I got to the stage where literally I couldn't progress any further because I couldn't press R3. So then I noticed in Miles Morales they fixed it, so I was really happy with that. So I could like bind more buttons, and I was able to just press the buttons as well because they had the toggle options. So all that really helped in PS5 and Miles Morales.
Yeah, exactly. That's a perfect example of exactly the same thing. The first Spider-Man, they started thinking about accessibility. They were able to do like a couple of things, and it was actually a really, really important game as well, because when that came out, and God of War as well, they had a lot of accessibility considerations for its time. You know, even only a couple of years later, it seems really basic by today's standards, but for its time, they both had like multiple accessibility options. And those two games, God of War and Spider-Man, were the two most critically acclaimed, top-selling games on the PlayStation of that year. So that really solidly kind of put to bed once and for all that idea that thinking about accessibility is somehow going to impact your creative vision and make your game less enjoyable by deleting down the stuff. Well, top two games of the year, can't argue with that, you know. So that was really important in itself. But exactly what you're saying, Miles Morales goes so much further above that. And it's nice kind of community that goes around it amongst developers as well, because game development can be quite kind of like siloed and secretive, but accessibility seems to be a topic where studios are and individual developers are much more willing to kind of be open and share information and celebrate each other's successes and come together and discuss things. So it's really nice seeing all these different companies all learning from each other and all like pushing the bar further as they go along, you know.
Yeah, it's good. They're kind of the more they help each other out, the further I suppose we're gonna get in terms of accessible games.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I mean, I think going back to Uncharted 4, when Uncharted 4 came out, which is a PlayStation exclusive, like it's a game you can only get on the PlayStation in order to sell more PlayStations. Phil Spencer, who is the head of Xbox, jumped on Twitter to congratulate PlayStation on the accessibility efforts in that game. You know, like head of Xbox praising a like exclusive PlayStation game isn't something that happens very often. But like I said, accessibility seems to be a topic that is able to bring people together and get them to kind of step over those traditional boundaries.
Yeah. Another question was, a lot of us kind of already know about the different hardware available, but what about software? And like stuff like game settings. Why is that so important, or just as important as hardware controllers, etc.?
So you mean like third-party software, like
Stuff like that.
Games? Yeah. Yeah, there are a range of things. It's a bit tricky though, because it starts to get into the territory of software that people use to cheat in games. So there's basically a clash between those things. When I think a nice example of that is when a game by Ubisoft called For Honor launched. For Honor didn't have button remapping within the game itself, so people who needed it were forced to use external software. That meant that they were in breach of the terms of service of the game. You're not allowed to use external software in case it's cheating. So they just got banned from playing the game. That meant that when that game launched, there was like press articles going up about like disabled people being banned from playing the game. That's not the kind of press you want accompanying your game when it launches, right? So that's it's a tricky area what to do about those kind of situations. But ultimately, if they had put remapping in the game itself, that issue would never have arisen. So I think that's an important aspect of it, is how of avoiding those situations, is how much of those external third-party solutions can actually be taken inside games. But there are other considerations as well. So things like if a developer can actually allow the game to be run in a window, so that somebody can have like an on-screen keyboard over the top, things like that. But yeah, it's a piece of the puzzle. The external software includes things like screen readers as well. So for example, like an external piece of software that a blind person will use to have the text inside a piece of software spoken out to them. Yeah, so that kind of middle ground of the third-party software, and also, like you said, the hardware and the accommodations that game developers can make inside the games themselves.
Yeah, definitely. So what do you think it's going to do in the future? Are we heading in the right direction? And how long do you think it will take before all games are accessible?
Yeah, well, that's it. Like we're making a ton of really, really nice progress, and the amount of progress there's been in the past couple of years is more progress than was made in the 10 years leading up to that. It's accelerating. But we still are really at the beginning. I don't want to do down the progress that's been made because it's really nice, but we're still not yet at a point where there has been a single like AAA like big name console game. I haven't ever seen a single one that's managed to even get the basics right. So that means like the most commonly complained about things are text size, remapping, color blindness, subtitle presentation, how intense like the effects and camera work are. I haven't seen a single game at that end of the industry to even get those basics right. I'm quite confident that's going to happen very soon with the speed things going at. But it's not about even those basic things either. Where we really need to get to is a point where, while it's not really possible for a game to be accessible to absolutely everybody, because that's kind of part of the definition of what a game is, there needs to be some kind of barriers that you're coming up against, and any kind of barrier in a game is going to be exclusionary to someone. So it's more about figuring out which of those barriers are unnecessary, and most of them are. They're just there unintentionally locking people out from having the kind of experience developers want. But that's where we need to get to, though, is basically the point where anyone can pick up any game and have at least a reasonable expectation that they're not going to be unnecessarily locked out, So we're still a long way off from that, but all the pieces are in place, all of the processes are being worked out. The enthusiasm is there, the momentum is there, developers are learning from each other, and they're excited about the topic as well. So the pieces are in place. We just have to make sure that momentum is maintained, and we keep pushing the same direction. And hopefully, if we can do that, then we can get to a point where all gamers and all developers as well can benefit from everything that accessibility has to offer.
Yeah.
How difficult it is to implement things, that is a very good question, and the answer is it depends.
Yeah.
So what it depends on is at what stage of development you consider it. So for a lot of features, that is really, really important. If I give you an example, like text size, which is hands down the most common accessibility complaint in games, tiny text, and it kind of comes about through the way that games are designed. Because I can see behind you now, you've got a TV in your living room. Game developers don't make games on TVs in living rooms. They make them on a massive monitor right in front of their face. There's a mismatch there. But yeah, so really, really common complaint, text size. And if you go back in after a game has already been made and try and change all the text size from tiny up to bigger, when you've already designed all the boxes and stuff to fit a certain size of text, all that kind of stuff, it can be really, really difficult and really expensive. They actually went in and did that on the Outer Worlds, and it took them 3 months to change the text size in that game. Whereas if you're at the start of development, if you just decide before you make any text, we're not going to have any tiny text in this game, that's it, the work is done. It's just a design decision. There's other things like that as well, even like color blindness. If you decide at the outset, I'm not going to rely on color on its own to differentiate and communicate things, that's a design decision. Versus if you realize at the end, I've used color for loads of stuff, then I have to go back in like trying to design modes and stuff to compensate for that. So that's a really, really big factor in how difficult it is to implement this kind of stuff, is what stage of development you consider it at, which is why it's so important that we're now approaching like this next generation on, where these companies are actually having the opportunity to think about this stuff early in development. So that can only lead to good things.
Yeah. For me, the thing that helps me the most in making games accessible is firstly keybinds, and secondly,
what, sorry?
Firstly, it's keybinds.
Yep.
And secondly, it's I don't know if you've ever played or heard of Arma 3.
Yes, I haven't played it, but I've heard of it.
Okay, so it's a PC game, and it's probably the best feature I've ever had. Is basically a double tap feature or a triple tap feature on buttons. That's like, to me, that's the best. Like, that would make me be able to play maybe twice as many games as I can play now. So if
Yeah,
that's
so that's
implemented across everything, then
that's starting to appear in a few other games as well.
because
so if you look at which games are they? Destiny 2 recently patched in that functionality. There's a Ubisoft game that recently had it as well. I think it might have been Far Cry New Dawn. But basically, when you go in to remap the buttons, every single button has a press, a double tap, and a hold for like every single one of the buttons. So you can essentially reduce like the number of buttons that you need to be able to press, but you can shrink that number down significantly by laying them up on the same button, exactly like you're saying.
Yes, it's so good.
But that also goes hand in hand with complexity of controls, right? Because just because a controller has got like 20 buttons on it doesn't mean as a developer you're required to make use of every single one of those 20 buttons, right? And that's it. As you know, like even if you can only just have like 1 or 2 buttons that are unused on the controller, that makes remapping so much more powerful, right? There was actually a talk by the developers of Destiny 2 talking about how they implemented that functionality. And they had a tough time of it because they were starting with, again, this is very, like, the game had already been out for years and had a very, very complicated control scheme. So talking about the kind of challenges they had in trying to implement a detailed remapping scheme like that into a game that already had those kind of controls. So in terms of both like your personal interest in that feature and also what you're asking about, like how difficult is this kind of stuff to implement, I think you should find that quite an interesting watch. I think something there's a lot of potential for is more use of contextual controls. So where pressing the button does different things depending on the circumstance you're in at the time. So have you played FIFA with its simplified control options?
So basically I normally play alternate, but then when I get tired, I only use 2 buttons. And
exactly, that kind of
stuff. It was really helpful.
So I'd like to see that applied across other games as well. There was a really, really nice example of that on one of the mobile Assassin's Creed games, Assassin's Creed Identity. And that you can actually play most of the game just using 1 stick and 1 button. So contextually, so the second you technically, because you can plug in hook up your controller by Bluetooth for it. You can, if you want, use the right stick to look around, but you don't really need to because the camera is quite clever and it is generally looking in the right direction. So use the 1 stick for navigating around, and the button is contextual. So if you are facing the front of a building and press the button, it'll assume that means you want to run up the side of the building. If you're stood behind an enemy, it assumes the button is that you want to assassinate them. If you stood behind a bale of hay, it assumes you want to jump into it. But normally, on the regular full control version of Assassin's Creed, every one of those is its own individual button, And it was interesting to play it because it really, even though, so you got that one button, you've also got a second button which brings up like a little radial menu to choose, like if you want to do a skill or something like that. But just through playing with that one stick and that one button, it still really felt like you were playing Assassin's Creed, right?
Yeah.
Just the same as playing FIFA with the two buttons. So I think there's a lot of potential for exploring that in other genres outside of FIFA as well.